everyone, and welcome to this webinar on urban density and policy to manage density post-COVID-19, organized by the International Growth Center's Cities That Work initiative, as well as New York University's Marin Institute. My name is Priya Mannering, and I'm an economist at the International Growth Center based in Uganda. So as a brief background on the organizing partners behind this event, the International Growth Center is a research institute and policy institute working with government partners in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia on research relating to economic growth and development. Cities That Work is a global initiative run by the IGC that brings together expertise from policymakers, practitioners, and academics in informing key issues related to urban development. The Marin Institute of Urban Management at NYU is an institute dedicated to innovative applied research on the critical challenges of urban living. So today's event is going to be looking at the relationship between density and development, bringing together experts in urban economics, as well as urban planning and urban policy making to consider both the risks of density in relation to the spread of infectious diseases such as COVID-19, but also how fast-growing developing cities can manage their density better in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to begin with a panel discussion before opening up to a Q&A. So from our online audience. So please do feel free to add your questions and comments in the chat box as we proceed with the panel discussion so that we can make sure to include these as part of our discussion. The event is being recorded and is also being live streamed on Facebook and forms one of two different public events that the IGC is putting together ahead of World Cities Day that takes place on the 31st of October. So without further ado, let me introduce the excellent panel that we have for today's discussion. So maybe I'll just start with Jennifer Musisi, who is a senior advisor at the IGC, Cities That Work council member, as well as city leader in residence at the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. From 2011 to 2019, she also served as executive director of the Kampala Capital City Authority in Uganda. We also have Tony Venables with us, who is a professor of economics at the University of Oxford and is also on the governing council of Cities That Work. He's published extensively on spatial economics and also directs a program of research on urbanization in developing countries. We also have Umar Silla, who is the acting director for the Regional Office for Africa at UN Habitat. His work focuses primarily on issues related to land and governance, and he leads UN Habitat's Global Land Tool Network Unit. So as we move forward with our panel discussion, I would encourage our panelists to feel free to answer any of the questions that I raise so that we can make sure to have a very lively discussion. So thank you very much for being with us today. And I think what we'll start off with as part of our panel discussion is considering what we mean by urban density and whether it's a good or a bad thing. So Tony, maybe I can start with you to ask you, what do you think is the relationship between density and development? Is density something we should be targeting for cities?
Okay, well, I think there are two questions there. One is, what's the relationship between density and development? And the other is, should we be targeting it? Then let me give a very short answer to the first one and then a somewhat longer answer to the second. And the first one, yeah, as development occurs, cities get larger, and as cities get larger, they get denser. So as a matter of fact, or at least the urban core gets denser, so they tend to get denser on average. So as a matter of fact, there is a positive relationship, and simply as a matter of fact. That recent work by the OECD and the European Commission on the global settlement layer, global human settlement layer, enables some quite careful, enables cross-country comparisons to be made between city size and city growth. And that really does point out that if you look at urban population growth over the last 20 years, it's been about 2/3 of it has been accommodated by densification, and 1/3 by city expansion. So yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a positive relationship. Okay, I think your second question was, well, I'm going to paraphrase, was how do we think about density? I mean, what are the goods and bads? How should we think about it? The main point I want to get over here is, density is not an end in itself. I think it's quite dangerous to start thinking of density as a sort of goal, something we have to achieve. The objective is to enable people to access jobs, firms to access workers, firms to access markets, firms to access suppliers, suppliers to access firms. So the objective is to enable sort of intense economic interaction through access, right? So I think it's important to think in those terms. Okay, well, how do you do that? You could imagine doing it in different ways. You could spread stuff out, but you almost surely don't want to do that. Some things are very lumpy. You don't want to chop your football stadium up into 50 different little ones, right? It's big. You can't spread it out. And obviously, if there are agglomeration forces, so the CBD, the Central Business District, really wants to cluster together, there are going to be big efficiency losses in chopping it up and spreading it out. So you can spread it out. That's one thing, but you don't want to do that. Or not too much. There are costs to doing it. Let me be a bit more cautious in what I'm saying there. Another way of doing it is you can concentrate it, but then build lots of roads and have lots of cars, right? And that's obviously, then during a certain period of history, that was the way a lot of cities developed. A lot of cities got built, but that's clearly expensive. It's expensive in terms of time. It's expensive in terms of building roads. And obviously looking to the future in terms of climate, there are real problems with that spread out model. Or the third way you could get access is by putting things close together. So eventually we're getting to density. But of course you can put things close together in different ways. I mean, slums are dense. I take it we're not going to say slums are good things. I'm certainly not going to. I mean, they may be necessary things that occur. Or you can achieve density by essentially good planning and building tall and sort of modern densification of the sort we see in many cities in East Asia in particular, of course. I think I'll stop there. I mean, that's sort of set a map of the way I see it and some of the trade-offs and one fact. But let me pause there and hand to others, and I can come back if.
Excellent. No, thanks, Tony. And so maybe I can turn to Jennifer to give her thoughts on this topic. So Jennifer, given your experience, extensive experience working in urban development, what do you think are some of the kind of gains from urban density, but then also some of the challenges that you've faced in relating to growing urban density in cities? Sorry, Jennifer, I think you're on mute, just in case you want to unmute yourself.
One of the biggest challenges that a lot of urban planners, urban managers, and anyone to do with urban design is grappling with right now in the current COVID-19 situation is how to rethink cities. Because cities are basically structured and built to bring people together. Cities are about the life and the energy, the continuity and the interdependence that comes from bringing people and facilities and offices and industry together. So right now, when we look at the advantages and disadvantages of densification, I think we need to put it, perhaps again putting it in the context of COVID-19 right now, and then to see how will cities survive in spite of the pandemic. Because the density that we're discussing today, whether it's density of structures or density of population, as Tony was mentioning, creates the markets that the business community needs. It creates the life, the community that city dwellers leave the countryside for. It creates the interconnectivity that all the businesses depend on. the economies of scale for, say, utility provision. You want to run utility lines to one place and not a multitude of places and serve the biggest number of people possible. Also, the optimal land use is important, especially for cities. Land is very expensive. So you want to optimize land use by densification. And that's why a lot of high rises have come up in the past, and cities identified with high rises. The services, the interdependability of cities. So the density creates all these positive things. But right now we're dealing with a public health crisis caused by people living and working close together. And the effort is, how can we continue having lively, vibrant cities that are alive without increasing the risk of spread of COVID-19? And I think COVID-19 has given us a taste of what other pandemics could be. A year ago, no one thought we'd have a pandemic. No one thought we'd have a pandemic of this scale. But right now, having gone through this pandemic as we're going through it right now, we have to plan as if there may be another pandemic in future. We cannot run away from that fact. So the community, the services, the markets, and all those great things that come with densification also come with the challenges of public health. They come with challenges of pollution. They come with challenges of overstretched resources, challenges of crowding and the effects of crowding, the not so positive crowding in the low-income areas, the urban sprawl. I think Tony mentioned that as well, and the pressure on the cities as people come in without adequate facilities or funding. So cities are grappling right now. We want the benefits of densification, but we also are very aware of the risks of densification. And that's the discussion that we are all having. And I believe in the course of this discussion, we will hear some great ideas of how to tackle this going forward, both as planners and as city administrators. So there are positives, but there are also big challenges that we're facing as cities right now.
Great, thanks very much, Jennifer. So Umar, maybe I can turn to you to ask you about, basically, based on your work in cities across the world, do you see some sort of common challenges faced by cities in managing density well? And maybe related to that, I wanted to ask you, in many countries, we do see resistance at the national level towards increasing urban expansion and urban density. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on whether those concerns are justified, particularly in light of the recent pandemic. Is there reason to be cautious of increased density?
Thank you, Priya. I mean, allow me to put this discussion in the context of Africa. I think when it comes to Africa, this discussion of density, you have mixed feeling because, you know, there is pro and contra the issue of density. And as mentioned by Trevor, I think this increased population in Africa has huge, you know, pressure on infrastructure and others. So if you look at now in Africa, I think the rate of urbanization is so fast, one of the fastest run, you know, in the world, 4.5 we are talking about. So at the same time, I think we are seeing now emerging different secondary cities in many countries in Africa. And these secondary cities, the reason why they are emerging, because they want to tackle the issue of density. Because if you look at, for example, big cities like Nigeria, Lagos, like Dakar, or like Kinshasa, they are all saturated. Because the reason of that is the pull factor that we have been facing in the past. Because people come to look for jobs. People come for building infrastructure for health aspect and others. And this has yielded to this, you know, informality we can see as well in many countries. That's why I think this density sometimes can have, you know, this, reverse effect, you know, on the way that we are seeing our cities. And now we see this informality in many countries. And because of that as well, around any big cities, you know, agglomeration, you can see the informal settlement sprawling. The second point as well, solution has been given exact from some countries, like in Senegal now. They are developing new cities, and the cost is so expensive as well, without looking into the root causes of this overpopulation, for example, in the particular country. Senegal, we are talking about Diamniadio, we are talking about urban pole in many areas that they want to establish it. The question is, who's going to finance on that as well, which is one challenge we are facing when it comes to managing density as well. The cost associated with that, knowing that local government doesn't have enough, resources to tackle this matter. Another issue as well we need to look at as well, on the planning element, because right now we need to distinguish, what we call a sprawl and what is density as well. I think if not managed, we can lead to this sprawl system that we can see in many countries, and we can say even mushrooming. So what needs to be done on the physical planning? I think that's where the question is very important now in the context of COVID-19. What's the new paradigm we need to approach this issue of cities in Africa, where you have emerging secondary cities from 200,000 to 1 million population that needs infrastructure, but also can have some, downside effect in terms, of security, but also in terms of access to basic services. That's some element that we need to look at as well. The third point, I think, is more about looking capacity as well, some challenges managing density in Africa cities. So look at, for example, the number of town planners we have in Nigeria. So proportion is 1 for 100,000 people, for example, in serving the purpose. How we can deal with the planning issues, that's some issue as well we need to look at it. Overall, I think, on this element we are seeing, of course, density is giving something very positive, because in the way that government cannot fulfill the need of all communities or all agglomeration in terms of infrastructure, I think getting a way of people accessing to this, infrastructure in terms of health, in terms of sport, in terms of public space is something which is very positive. And that's something we see as positive during this COVID-19, because if people are spread, over the space, it will be difficult for them to get access to this infrastructure. That's something we need to acknowledge as one factor, which has been positive is the COVID-19. But overall in Africa, when it comes to density, we need to make the connection as well with informality, informal settlement, where we have 45% of population living in informal settlement in many cities in Africa without decent services, without basic services, with the risk of health, infection and others. I think those are some challenges we can see. In addition to the policy, now we need to look at it, how our national urban policy can be used as well as a catalyst if you want to address those issues in a durable manner. So over. Yes.
Great, thank you very much. I think some of your comments are leading quite naturally on to the next section of our discussion, which will be on areas for policy and how policy can actually be implemented to enhance density. So maybe I'll just take a second now to introduce our final panelist, Solly Angel, who is here. He's Professor of City Planning at New York University and leads the groundbreaking urban expansion project that's working with governments across the developing world to both document and also better plan for urban expansion. Thanks for being with us today. So maybe I'll, sorry to put you on the spot like this, but maybe I'll just ask you for your reflection. What we've been talking about so far is both, well, whether density is something cities should aim to achieve, or are there clear challenges associated with density? And in particular, I think it would be really interesting to get your thoughts on whether the recent spread of COVID-19 that's largely been concentrated in cities presents somewhat of a cautionary tale for density. Do we need to rethink how we're planning for cities and how we think about density, as some of the panelists have touched upon? It would be great to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Priya. I apologize for being late. I got the hours confused. I think that density is getting blame that it shouldn't be getting. There have always been enemies of density, and in fact, we've seen over the last century a general decline in density with the advent of the car, with the increases in income, and with the decentralization into the suburbs of both people and jobs. So the trend to de-densify cities has been with us actually since the middle of the 19th century. And we are finding a balance. Now, of course, that will continue. But I think that the issue and the pandemic and the numbers that I get density is not to blame. The difference between the number of cases is very much a function of the size of cities rather than their density. So we find a very strong, you might say, scaling relationship between large cities and pandemics. And large cities, by definition, have a lot more contacts, have a lot more interaction. And it is these large cities that are, in fact, our economic engines. Now, it's very clear that the larger the city, the more productive it is. And that I don't think that we're going to give up on that productivity and decentralize to smaller cities that are much less productive and much less vulnerable to economic and political changes. So my sense of it is that density needs to be supported and strengthened, and we haven't done anything about that, even though planners have been talking about it for the last 30 years. We haven't done anything about it because the only thing that planners have done is trying to contain expansion, which generally hasn't worked in the majority of cases, instead of making room for densification, instead of making it possible to increase the density in cities. Now, in places like Africa, if you take Kinshasa, for example, we have very high overcrowding, as pointed by our colleague here, and that is partly the result of poverty and the inability to fund higher density or multi-level housing. So the reason that that Kinshasa is overcrowded is because all the houses are 1 and 2 stories high, and Hong Kong, which has got higher density than Kinshasa, has got a lot less overcrowding because of its ability to build up. So I think with economic development, we should be able to get higher density and to encourage making room for density. And I think that that would be the productive and the equitable and the resilient way to move forward.
Great. Thanks very much, Sully. So I wonder if any of our panelists have any further thoughts on kind of the implications of COVID-19 for changing the way we think about density, but so I'll leave a brief moment for any further interjections.
Yes, I just wanted to add a point to what Asoli mentioned on the differences between Africa, for example, and the rest of the world in terms of densification. I think there's also a cultural perspective that we need to bring to light. A lot of the African culture is about spreading out in villages. Within the villages, they'll have units, but people like living in large spaces. So whereas people live in the cities in Africa, a lot of them also have a country home on a large space of land. And the bigger the space, the more affluent you're considered to be. So sometimes the challenge is also to do with attitudes, where middle and high income people consider living in high-rise apartments as not desirable just because of perhaps a cultural perspective, more than just a financial perspective. People generally don't like living in high-rise buildings, and I think that's a lot to do with cultural norms and the way people look at community.
May I interject here for a moment?
Yes.
Thank you, Jennifer, for this very important comment. I just want to point out to you that when you look at the literature on China, you find exactly what you are talking about, that the Chinese people were living on the ground in 1 and 2 story buildings for generations, and they were very much against high density living in high rise apartment. And when you read the literature 30, 40 years ago, this is what you find, great resistance to high rise living by the Chinese. Now, what you see over time is that that has changed, and that the Chinese are now, because of the change into an urban culture from a rural or a more traditional culture, and with that come a more acceptability of high-rise living.
Great. Thanks
Priya,
very
can I
much.
just
Please do.
respond, agree with a couple of things Solly just said. Yeah, good densification, the high rise is expensive, as Solly said, but over the life of the building, it's not so expensive. It's a matter of capital cost. It's upfront funding, right? So yeah, it is economically efficient as well as desirable in all sorts of ways, I think, to achieve this high quality density. But you have to be able to borrow. You have to have access to the upfront funds, and that's something where you need institutional mechanisms to support it, and frankly, the international community, the donor community, to support it. Although that would only ever be a drop in the ocean of the sums required. But we have to think in those terms. It's not fundamentally expensive. It's just that it's front loaded. Turning to COVID, I do think there's a bit of a danger that we sort of exaggerate. Oh, it's a big city phenomenon. I'm sitting in Europe, and did the big cities back in March, April. It's now doing the secondary cities and towns in the second wave, and who knows what will happen in the third wave. So obviously it's spread by human interaction, but it's not restricted to big cities. It may start there, but it's going to go everywhere. So let's not pretend it's a particular problem of big cities. One other COVID comment, some cities have obviously handled it extremely well. You need the health institutions, the tracking, the tracing. Some European, some Asian cities, we know have handled it well, not by demolishing the city and rebuilding it in a different way, but by having the institutions, the systems that can do the things you got to do: the tracking, the tracing, the early diagnosis, and so on.
Can I
come in? Or, no, sorry.
Maybe Prima, if you want to provide some comments, and then
I think there's no doubt on this relevance of density in every context we are talking about, African, China's, and others. This is even a consensus from this habitat renegotiation, where everybody acknowledges, the importance of high density to minimize cost of urban infrastructure and prevent urban sprawl. But I think one challenge we are facing in Africa is the cost associated with that as well. And when it comes to cost, look at the area of housing as well, which is one of these, important aging, for densification. I think Solly has talked about the model of China. But if you look at the model that has been promoted in Africa for years, was flat system, not horizontal. And that's the reason why the culture comes with it as well. And this has contributed a lot to spreading, all this habitation. For example, when I visited, years back in Jamena with my director at the time, executive director, Juan Clos, the house is so big. And Juan Clos was saying we need to regularly look at the size of the houses because we need to look at the density and work, into vertical, instead of going horizontal. Is one element. The second element as well, and when it comes to cost now, of course, there is willingness in many of these countries, and just finished a conversation before this meeting with the peers of Kenya on housing. They want to boost these housing sectors. But the issue is capital and affordability. We are all talking about affordability of housing now in Africa. We have all over the place, project of housing in all countries, but the financial mechanisms are not there. At the end of the day, we get back to this initial situation where people cannot afford it and they're going to hide themselves another way. And that way we have informal settlement. We have 80% of the economy in African cities, generated by informal sectors as well. How are you going to cater these people in terms of, of housing and access to basic services? And those are some tough questions we need to think about. What is the model if you want really to promote, this densification, because which is good as well in terms of filling the gap in terms of access to basic services, but at the same time, knowing that the density will come with high cost of housing and others, how to make it affordable, how to make it democratized for everybody to access to that. I think the reason why it's more about expansion than look into densification. Over. Yes.
Can I also just mention that you rarely have a discussion about densification and high rises or types of building design without bringing in a conversation about land rights and land ownership. the cities may want to do densification in a positive way, but the issue of land rights, land ownership always comes in. And if I take the example of Kampala, where I was, the land on which the city sits is owned by at least 5 property owners, private and corporate property owners. So the designs and the decisions regarding what is going to be built where are often impacted by who owns the land. And then issues of compensation come in if you want to get control over the land. And then some land is open-ended lease systems, perpetual ownership, the others are leases. So there's a lot of mix there, and that definitely impacts issues to do with densification in cities. The other positive thing that I just wanted to mention with densification regarding health, looking at the example of China, where this pandemic started in terms of visibility, we were able to see the Chinese systems limit the spread or make efforts to limit the spread within certain zones within the city. And I can imagine if you have a high rise with 300 people living in there, and then you identify infection in a couple of those people, it's much easier to control the spread if you control access or exit from that building, but also be able to reach people with services, medical services, food deliveries, and all those other things. So there are some positive, a lot of positive aspects of this discussion on densification as far as cities go.
I want to point out that as city planner, I was not very well read in the public health literature that pertains to cities, and I've had to make myself more literate in that. And in that literature, it's very interesting because they have a distinction between the urban health premium and the urban health advantage. So what they're saying, in continuation to what Jennifer was saying, what they're saying is the issue in a pandemic is whether the city is more vulnerable to the pandemic because of its organization, because of the large numbers of people, because of the large density of contacts between them, or does it have an advantage because it is better organized, it has better health services, it's easier to monitor and contact trace, it has better hospitals. So the issue has to be decided on a case by case. It's not automatically that cities have pay a healthcare penalty in a pandemic, and it's not automatic that cities have a healthcare advantage in a pandemic. So it's for us to see the evidence and the data to determine what happens in a particular pandemic in a particular city.
Great. No, thank you. I think the discussion so far has provided a really, really great overview of how we should be thinking about density, the risk of infectious disease, and as well as the potential for development. So maybe as we move towards thinking more about policy, the role of policy and ways in which we can be managing density better, Jennifer, I wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit more on what you see as some of the key causes for informal settlement in cities that creates density, but of the kind that from our discussion so far seems to perhaps be less easy to service with public goods and services, but also potentially offer a higher risk of transmission of diseases through overcrowding. So I wonder whether you could speak to what you think is, I know you've already mentioned issues related to land rights, and we've also talked about issues relating to affordability, but I wonder if you could talk about other reasons you think informal settlements are expanding in cities, but also what is the role of cities in planning better for informal settlement moving forward?
Speaking for the case of Africa, the informal settlements are created because cities exist. Everywhere where cities exist, everywhere development exists, you have informal settlements coming in. And these come because the city's planning strength, financial strength, development strength does not match the numbers of the rural-urban migration. The cities are overwhelmed with the numbers coming in every day, so the planning is not adequate. The other cause, of course, I mentioned is land rights. Cities many times do not control these spaces where the urban sprawl moves to, because it's privately owned or it's somewhere between different owners and all that. But wherever we see development, people will inevitably come looking for jobs. And the attraction for jobs, for services, for where you have limited healthcare facilities or education facilities, you have people coming from outside the city to benefit from these services or work within these services. And it's a constant challenge for cities to keep up with the urban sprawl. But also, I think, as Omar mentioned, a lot of cities, including the developing ones, are challenged with just human resource capacity to manage planning and development in cities. The city planners, the designers, and of course the financiers to be able to finance good housing or workspaces for people is a challenge. So people will come into the cities because they need to have livelihoods. They want to have services, they want to have security created by cities, but also the life and the vibe created by cities. People will come. And we cannot run away from the inflow. I think we just have to look at how to upscale in terms of our capacity, in terms of our policies, and in terms of providing financial resources to developers where there's limited financial ability to provide resources to enable the developers to do the buildings that we think will accommodate these people for workspaces, but also accommodation, which is a very expensive capital outlay, as we have already mentioned. So the challenge will continue. The challenge will continue, and we just have to look at different policies. And now every city is reviewing its policies in terms of the health situation that we're just going through right now, reviewing, tweaking, establishing new policies. I believe on buildings where designers are looking at utilizing things like natural ventilation, utilizing available spaces, retrofitting them to make these spaces healthier for people coming into cities, workspace expansion and distancing. So there are a lot of issues, a lot of challenges, and I'm impressed at how much cities have already done to continue functioning, because it's not been easy, but there's a lot of work that has already been done.
Great, thank you. And maybe when we're also thinking about different models for the kind of productive density that we were referring to earlier, Solly, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between urban density and urban expansion, because much of the literature.
I was going to continue from where Jennifer left.
Sure.
And I, as a city planner, like her, mourn the demise of effective urban planning. Now, the whole idea of urban planning, traditionally over the centuries, was to prepare a space for the city to expand into. That was the role of planning. And the idea is we have to lay out the infrastructure and ensure that there is adequate rights of way for principal roads for the expansion to get there. So for me, it'll take me a minute to explain. For me, the story is about the public sector engaged in making room for the city to grow and expand, both internally by making room for densification, which I've already mentioned, and expansion, making room through creating new spaces on the urban periphery. And I agree with Jennifer that there are serious land issues when it comes to particular cities in Africa, countries in Africa. But I'll give you the example of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is, one of the poorest countries, one of the least urbanized countries. And in Ethiopia, we've been able to get numerous cities to prepare for their orderly expansion by creating a grid of arterial roads on the urban periphery, acquiring the rights of way for these roads, moving people into to the side of the road and formalizing their informal status by giving them 99-year leases. And these cities, the secondary cities, the regional capitals, have created hundreds of kilometers of roads, tens of thousands of plots for housing, and a lot of room for industry to expand. And this has been done with very limited resources and with very little human resources that Jennifer is talking about, because it's a very simple program. It's just that estimate the amount of land you will need in the next 30 years, plan an arterial grid in this land and acquire the rights of way for that grid, protect land that you want to protect from development, and then just move ahead. And that has been very successful. So all I'm saying is, and that has been done at relatively high density too. It doesn't mean that new construction, just because we have a density curve, will be low density. In African cities, peripheral areas are high density as well. So I think that we need to simplify the planning process. We need to, instead of inviting consulting firm from the north to do master plans, we need to empower local governments to give them the skills, to give them the capacity to do their plan, which is what we've done in Ethiopia. And we have to make room. And when you make room in an orderly fashion, both formal and informal communities arise, and it's much easier to manage them when there is a grid, when there is a layout. And teaching people how to do layout has been relatively simple as well. So all of that, I think, from the point of view of policy, what people have to remember is that the role of government is to prepare cities in advance of their occupation for urbanization.
Great, thanks very much, Sully. So Tony, maybe I can ask you to give your thoughts on what's been discussed already, but also to perhaps share a few thoughts on areas for reform in terms of existing government regulations on land. So in many cities, regulations already exist on land that sort of artificially restrict density. So I wonder if you could also touch on that.
Well, let me first download the couple of thoughts and reactions I have in my head. Yeah, clearly cities will expand as well as densify. So Solly's points on, planning that, the road layout and everything, I completely accept. But I would put a cautionary note on it. The politics of this, it's just much easier to build some roads out of town and move the farmers than it is to sort out some of the city centre embedded rights, property problems. So, I think, well, just to call, the cautionary note that Solly's very well aware of, that, planners can just say, well, let's pave out of town, and that's, that's the way out of the problem. And it's, there is a risk there of, low density development. So that's just a cautionary note. The other thing on migrants coming in, I mean, clearly it's very, very difficult for any city to cope with the sorts of numbers that we're seeing. But just, I think it's important to think about that problem, to think about the sort of stock and the flow dimensions. I mean, what the city needs to be doing, or what you want to happen, is to have people moving through the slums, right? You're not building for the new people who are coming in, but you're hoping that people been in the slums some years, some generations, will have accumulated the assets to move on. And clearly, as they move on, they create space. So you're containing the amount of slum, hopefully reducing the amount of slum. But just a sort of mental frame for thinking about it, moving existing slum dwellers on is the way to think about it, rather than housing incoming people. I've forgotten what your question was. I think it was a very practical policy one. That should probably go to Jennifer or someone.
Well, yes, maybe I can.
No, go ahead.
I think what I turned to was the idea of existing regulations that city governments often have on urban land that artificially restrict density. So I wonder whether you or anyone else on the panel had any thoughts on reforms that city governments can take to existing regulations to make them more conducive to productive density while still limiting the damaging effects of overcrowding, let's say.
Well, let me just say something very, very quick and then very general. I mean, they have to be context specific and time specific. Circumstances change, and if you just lock yourself into some land policy that was introduced decades ago and has lots of incumbent rent owners benefiting from it, you've got a problem. Let me stop with that generality.
Great, thank you. And I realize we're actually running out of time, unfortunately. I think we could all talk about policies for urban density for much longer, but maybe I'll just ask Umar if you could provide your thoughts on, you've touched on throughout this discussion that there's more work to be done to get from planning on paper to planning in practice. And I wonder whether you could speak to what you see as some ways in which urban planning in practice can be improved upon, and what can be done for more effective implementation of planning at both the city level and the national level to encourage productive density.
Thank you, Priya. So I would like to react as well on Mr. Angel's point on Ethiopia. I think he put it rightly. He very simplified the matter, but it's not simple as it is, as mentioned by Tony. And I think this is context specific as well as the issue we are talking about, densification, urbanization, even talking about the land issues, because I study anthropology, legal anthropology, and we know what is the issue that policy are facing in Africa in terms of ownership, in terms of implementability of all these policies, that's challenge we are facing. In the land sector, the same question. We have always a conflict between statutory, and a customary system, which is blocking a lot of investment in cities in Africa. Jennifer can touch the example of Uganda with all this expropriation going on, all this conflict between the government and others. So, of course, this is bringing us also the dimension of governance as well. What level of democracy do we have in the country? But also, what level of participation do we have in the country? And to respond to your question, Priya, it's very important to have community engagement on the planning. I think now there's a lot of evolution in Africa now. We have all these participatory mechanisms that people establish. We have this budgeting participatory system that can allow people to know where the resources come and where the resources are going, and they have something to say. For me, that's the way that we need to design our cities. It's not casting stone or borrowing from others, but what is the reality of the cities? Knowing that the major driver, which is a pull factor, is livelihood and livability of the cities, for people can enjoy the cities, healthiest part of the cities as well. On that, I think it's very important. Community mobilization and engagement is very important. The second point as well, if you want me to talk about the future of this, planning process, make sure at least this planning caters the need of communities as well. So how you can build, right now, you can see a lot of mistakes put forth in the way that we are planning our cities. You go to Dakar, sometimes you can, run from 2 kilometers, you will not see a public space, a green space. How we can think about that, because people are meant to think about the value of land, the land grabbing system, again, which brings the element of governance, I think, which is very important. Capacity, of course, we need to give more resources and more time on training people and getting more urban planners, which is getting the sense of need of people at the community level. The last point, which is the challenge as things now, I think we mentioned Priya at the beginning, is the issue of informal settlement, of course. That's a huge elephant in the room now in Africa, and it's increasing because we have a lot of factors that can going to increase this informality. One factor is conflict. You go in the Sahel regions, all countries are prone to conflict, and people are moving from rural areas coming to the cities, which is increasing as well. If you want the congestion of communities in this, but also climate change with all this flood we are seeing. So I think on this, particular issue of informal settlement, I think we need to look at two dimensions: the prevention dimension and also the curative dimension. I think that's where we fail both on both sides, because on the prevention dimension, we do not see any authority anticipating in terms of reinforcing the planning rules, the building, build control building, and all this element that are needed for at least to accommodate those people, but also take into consideration the balance, the territorial balance. I think it's very important to think about territorial balance as well. How you can make sure there's a connection between rural and urban in the way that we are seeing infrastructure development, but also movement of population, so that you can create a value chain, in different areas, and not getting people, sitting in the cities. Because historically in Africa, many of these cities, they have been overpopulated because of some calamities from rural area. And this has completely, some impact on agriculture production. So on the slum upgrading, I think those are some elements that people have been looking, but I think there's more need to be done in the approach of slum upgrading, of super regeneration, that we need to make sure at least it's fair, but also serving the purpose of communities, but also how much we can get, scalable experience that can be, replicated to others. I think those are some thinking for me in the way that we want to fix, all these urban issues. When it's come, to city expansion sprawl. Over. Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So maybe I'll let any of our panelists make any further final reflections on what we've already discussed, and then we're going to move to the Q&A from the many questions that have come in over the course of our discussion.
Can I just mention that the issue of informal developments, land ownership, city planning, in a lot of countries is also a highly politicized issue. And there's a lot of tension between the national governments and the local government and the population in as far as this area is concerned. So it's important to have conversations and policies that are agreed upon at these different levels. The local governments may have really good planning policies and land use policies, but if the national government is not supportive of those policies, they will not be successfully implemented. And of course, the national government policies speak more to the people than the local government policies in a lot of instances. So I think the discussion on informal settlements, densification, urban sprawl, and anything land and land planning is a conversation that has to be held at all these different levels in unison, and then agreed upon in terms of what policies to implement, because there's so much potential political conflict there, as well as the social conflict that my colleagues have mentioned.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. I think that's very useful in thinking about realistic avenues for reform. So maybe I'll move on to putting some of the questions that have come from our online audience to the panel. I will try and take these in groups of 2 or 3 so that we have time for the panel to respond before I then select some of the other questions. So the first question I want to put to the panel is for the entire panel, and it's from Ms. Mimbo Changula, who is a principal planner of forward planning for the Ministry of Local Government in Lusaka, in Zambia. And their question is that managing densification and the limitations of land rights is extremely critical, and the fact that much of urban land in our cities is exhausted and urban renewal is very costly, but traditional land that exists on city peripheries presents an opportunity for city expansion. So the question here in that context is, how do we plan for urban growth where there are dual land systems of both state and traditional or customary land? So that's one question that maybe I'll ask Solly to give us his views on before, but I'll also put to the panel another question that we've received from Michael Marriott, who has a question relating to remote working. So this is actually also a question for Solly, which is, how do you see the shift to remote working as being part of the process of changing urban structures? So it appears that many organizations and corporations and governments are encouraging the shift to remote working. So how can planning support positive density and the growth of smaller cities as part of this. So maybe I can ask Solly to provide some initial thoughts on both of those before the rest of the panel also jumps in on those two questions.
Thank you, Priya. I think that what Jennifer just said about how politicized land issues are in Africa in general, but in all other countries as well. So I think that in Africa, where you have kind of multiple layers of land ownership, and where you have traditional or customary land ownership, is I think what you need, there are two approaches here. One is to do kind of one project at a time, which I think is what people have been trying to do, and I think that that has failed. And I think that what we need to do is kind of work at scale and try to get to build coalitions of customary landowners with government, and kind of get the benefits distributed so that it's in their interest to collaborate and to put the land in for development. Because we know very well that the value of land that is in rural use and the value of land that's in urban use is like 20 times more valuable. So it's a win-win situation. So the fact that these political conflicts are holding it back is a shame. And there has to be kind of a new age of coalition to do this thing on a very large scale, because we know, and we started out by talking about the fact that 1/3 of all the urban population growth between now and 2050 will be in sub-Saharan Africa. There's no secret there. So we have to prepare for these cities to double and triple in area. And the sooner we understand that, the better. The second, in terms of responding to the remote working, I think that I just want to point out that I had a professor that wrote a book in 1956 talking about that. It was Richard Meyer. He wrote a book called The Communications Theory of Urban Growth, in which he talked about distant work, but he was talking about the telephone and the television, and now we're talking about the web. This is happening, and again, will continue to happen. And I think that my take on it, and the people might disagree, my take on it is that companies are going to be pushing it, not labor. I don't think people like working remotely, but companies will be pushing it because it's lower rents. They don't have to pay for the housing of their workers. It's it's better for them. However, my feeling is that it's going to work in the short term, because they're still banking on the creativity and the relationships that were created when people were all working together. But in the long run, this is not a solution. In the long run, we need those face-to-face contacts and those intimate conversations and those close interactions for cities to continue to be creative and productive. So like I said, I think in the short run, you'll see a real effect of this, but that the cost of this will become more apparent over time.
Great, thank you. Tony, do you want to respond to some of the questions as well?
Yeah, just to the second one. I broadly agree with Solly, but I think I'd actually, try and be controversial by making an even stronger argument. I mean, I think we'll end up with people going into work several days a week. I mean, if people want to go in, they want the face-to-face, and I think firms will realize they need that. But maybe going in, 2 or 3 days a week, not 5 days a week. But if you think about that for a moment, does that make working in the city more or less attractive? Well, it makes it more attractive. Yeah, if the cost is commuting 5 days and you've only got to do it 2, then, you know, it becomes more attractive to work in the city. And there's all this office space if it's only being used by me 2 days a week. So, you know, put those arguments together and you've got more people who want jobs actually based in the city. So what I see possibly happening is that the hinterland, the sort of commuting hinterland of big cities will actually expand, because obviously, you know, the benefit of only traveling 2 days a week is a bigger benefit for people coming from a long way away. So that hinterland will increase. But yeah, maybe you'll actually end up with more people whose jobs are based in the city, more agglomeration. So I certainly don't see, I mean, that's all speculation, but I certainly don't see the sort of unraveling of big cities that some people have talked about.
Great, thank you. So maybe I'll just put a few more of the questions that have come in from the audience to our panel now. So from Dyson Jangia, we have the question of how can we achieve vertical densification in informal settlements against the backdrop of insecurity of land tenure and the poverty levels of inhabitants? So probing a little bit further into what can cities and national governments do, what can policymakers do, but also perhaps what can the private sector do to encourage vertical densification. So Umar, maybe I'll ask you to provide some initial reflections on that question. And then we've also got a question from Curtis Lockhart, who is head of research at Charter Cities Institute in DC. And then he has a question for Jennifer, but we would also like a comment from the broader panel, which is, he notes Rwanda's success over the last decade in land registration, and asks, is Uganda planning a similar titling drive to foster a more efficient land market, especially as Tony wrote in his African Cities World Bank report from 2017, that for well-functioning cities, you do need well-functioning land markets. So any comments you have on that, Jennifer, would be much appreciated. And then I'll put one final question, which is from H. Kumar from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, who has a question for both Tony and Solly, which is, how do you think the relationship between inequality and density is going to evolve in mega cities? So where we see lower skilled classes stuck in very low mobility gig economy jobs, are we going to see some sort of, is it likely that we'll see skill upgrading or a flight to the suburbs amongst the rich? So Umar, maybe if you can start with the first question and we can take it from there.
Thank you, Priya. I mean, I think when it comes to city, I mean, and urban setting, overall, even in Africa, I think we already start discussing the big elephant in the room is the land tenure issues, you know, which is hindering a lot of this initiative. And when it comes to slum upgrading, I think one of these key parameters of definition of, you know, informal settlement is deprivation of, you know, access to tenure security, which is key issues. So how to go about it? I think those are some questions that people have been asking most of the time. First element, I think, is depend on political will as well. How much will, you know, the government has to deal with that matter? Because it's not an easy matter. And I always say we need to crack the eggs if really we want to improve this informal settlement, in a sense that the government will be ready to put the capital necessary, but also you need to offer alternative to population. I think that's where the issue is. And when it's come even to compulsory acquisition of land, that's where the issue is most of the time. Giving alternative to population, to communities on a social base, you know, approach. That's some matter that I think we couldn't, you know, find too much, you know, a very good response to this problem. But from our experience as UN Habitat, I think we have been working with many grassroots organizations and informal settlement in Kenya in addressing this issue of tenure security. And first approach, as I mentioned earlier, make sure you have a community mobilization around the causes and others, because these people living in the informal settlement, they will know what they want. What is missing is just, you know, this means and this capital, they need to relocate themselves others. So we start, you know, mobilize the communities using light technology, you know, like open source, to establish database of registration of community land. And from there, we always use it to negotiate with government as well, to include, for example, in Kenya, in the case of Matare, for example, you have been successful against all this data of the structure of the population, and all this has been included in the KISI program for regularization of this informal settlement and upgrading of this informal settlement. And there's quite a number of negotiations that we can use in improving people's life in the particular area. But what is important, I think, is just for me, as I mentioned again, preventions. how you can prevent. Right now, we see how many secondary cities happening in Africa, how many cities growing, what needs to be done now. Again, the major driver is livelihood, access to jobs, access to decent livelihood and livable cities. That's what people want to see. How this government can put in place a social blanket and not looking into the high-class population when we are developing our cities. And that's where the issue of mixed use is very important, the way we are seeing our cities now. Because everybody needs a green space now. Everybody needs to go, fetching water. So how to make sure we have this mixed use and not just, addressing one category against others. And that's where inequality comes. And we have growing inequality in many African cities. And that's the reason why as well you have this informality increase, because where you see these big people, these rich people establishing themselves, around you have poor people. And that's how informal settlement comes. Where I used to live here in Kenya, in Runda, just next Runda in the back, you have many informal settlements. They need jobs. They come look for jobs. So I think we need to look at the social blanket. When we talk about planning, yes, for to enforce this planning issue, I think the whole issue is access to decent livelihood, but also make sure we work for equal cities and the equal chance for everyone. I think those are some points we need to look at. Over to you. Yes.
Great, Jennifer. I wonder if you could respond to the second question on land registration drives in Uganda.
Very briefly, the government of Uganda commissioned a judicial commission of inquiry into land matters, which completed its assignment recently. They did a very, very comprehensive review of everything land, including land ownership, land rights, land use, land acquisition. And they came up with a very detailed list of recommendations to government. Government is looking at those now, and it's very likely that the outcome will be quite a lot of positive impact on land issues, land holding, land rights, land development, land planning. So that has been ongoing, and it should yield good results in that area. I also just wanted to mention another challenge with developing peripheral lands. I think the question earlier was on, yes, cities want to develop peripheral lands. They want to partner with landowners, because this land is sometimes owned culturally, sometimes privately. But the challenge that always seems to persist is the financing of these projects. Who finances these projects? They're expensive. And as Soli mentioned, it's maybe better to scale rather than do little pockets of development. Scale and do a bigger project and have more people benefiting and therefore create credibility. But there's also the issue of, apart from affordability, apart from the politics, there's the issue of lack of strong partnerships and collaboration with these people that have rights to this land. In a lot of cases, there's no public trust in the city governments or the national governments. So people distrust governments, and a lot of times, unfortunately, it's out of experience that they've had in the past, where governments have created white elephants that were meant to benefit the population but did not, projects that sort of fizzled out and died, but also a lot of corruption sometimes in valuing these properties and compensating the owners. So these kinds of things frustrate trust and therefore dialogue and partnerships in developing these areas. So a lot of potential is lost just because of things like distrust, corruption, and a lack of cohesion between government and local governments, as I mentioned before. Over to you, Priya.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, I think we just have time for a response to the last question, which is around the relationship between density and inequality between cities. So Soli, did you want to provide some initial thoughts, and then maybe Tony, you can also add in on this?
Yes, let me answer that. I just want to make a small comment on what Jennifer was just saying. I think that one way to do these things at scale is to reduce their cost, and not to do all the infrastructure right there and then, but just kind of lay it out So what we're doing in Colombia, for example, is that we're preparing the periphery for expansion, but we're just planting trees along the future sidewalks of arterial roads. You know, we're not investing in these roads. This is to be done much later. So I think that you need this kind of skeleton plans that are much less expensive than actually investment in infrastructure in order to work at scale. This is just by way of comment on what you said. Let me just start by the answer to this last question by saying, by responding to what Anthony was saying yesterday, and that is, yeah, people would prefer to do some work from home and some work at their workplace. Well, poor people don't have that choice. Poor people generally don't have this ability to, you know, the janitors in the schools can't work remotely, neither can the kindergarten teachers or the firefighters or the delivery people or the people in the shops. And so low-income jobs are not candidates for telecommuting. So that's one of the reasons that we have more cases in poor areas. The other one is, again, I think Jennifer mentioned that, but it applies here, and that is kind of distrust of government and government regulation and having been betrayed by government before, so that these low-income communities have less of an interest in complying. You know, and rich communities are a lot more in compliance than poor ones. So I think, and the other thing is, again, is the metropolitan differences in qualities of healthcare, the distribution of hospitals, the distribution of clinics, the distribution of tests is very skewed. And so I think that what we need to think about, and I've been writing about it, and that is, and people have been aware of that 50 years ago, is we need a metropolitan response to this pandemic, which requires the decentralization and reallocation of resources for public health, for both enforcement and treatment and testing towards low-income communities. And that is not happening because of the fragmentation of the response to the pandemic and the lack of interest in these communities that remain, you know, as John Turner used to say, invisible.
Great, thank you. Tony, do you have any final thoughts on this question?
I mean, I think the question was partly about some long run trends in sort of inequality and city structure and city density, which I suppose I think are actually driven by long run changes in technology and the sort of employment structure of the country and then the city. I mean, and thinking about the UK, it's obviously, you know, massive deindustrialization. In London, that was replaced by moderately high skilled or very high skilled, you know, service jobs, financial sector, massive gentrification, upgrading of the city, and lots of pockets of real poverty. So, you know, inequality created. A lot of northern cities in the UK had the deindustrialization, but didn't have the gentrification. So maybe less inequality, but certainly more poverty. But these are, you know, so it's how, you know, so different cities will react in different ways to these, you know, fundamental long-run technological employment changes, which we will surely be facing.
Great, thank you. And I'm afraid we're out of time now as part of our discussion for today, but I just to maybe summarize some of the key ideas, I think we've discussed the fact that there's a clear link between density and development, both in accommodating urban expansion, but also in facilitating the spread of ideas and vibrancy that attracts people to cities. We've talked also about the potential costs of density, both in terms of the spread of disease and even pollution, and that it's really about the type of density that we're seeing in cities that matters, and that cities can come either with health risks or premiums depending on how the threat of infection is managed. And I think in terms of policy areas, we've touched upon a whole range of different areas for enhancing urban density. So that's everything from land rights to improving finance for housing investments to planning for effective expansion of cities, also taking into account potential low density development risks that may come with that. We've talked about the importance of context specific regulations. And we've also touched quite crucially on how to improve implementation of plans for urban density. So taking into account the very complex political processes behind some of this decision making, improving coordination between cities, national governments and metropolitan areas, simplifying planning processes to the point where we're not necessarily investing in roads, but could be simply planting trees, and also crucially engaging with communities, which I think is pretty key in perhaps enhancing compliance and reducing resistance to government regulations. So with that brief summary, I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers for the great discussion, as well as to our active audience. The next panel that the IGC is holding will be on the 28th of October, looking at urban governance and the role of cities at the center of COVID-19 recovery plans. So we'll expand on a lot of the stuff that we touched upon in the debate today. So the registration link will be up very soon, so please do look out for it. And our paper on land use planning is also available online for those of you who want to do a deep dive into some of the discussions we've had today. There will also be a brief survey immediately following today's Zoom meeting, so please do take a minute to fill that out. But with that, I will say thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to our audience.